While COVID-19 affected almost every facet of our lives, there is little doubt that one of the most lasting legacies will be its influence on changing how we work. Prior to the pandemic, only 5% of workdays on average were spent working from home in any given week. Now, for all the talk of flexible work practices, very few organizations and individuals had actually truly embraced the realities of remote work. And yet that changed overnight. Many of my clients sent home their entire workforce. We're talking hundreds, in some cases thousands of employees in the space of 36 hours in mid-March 2020. Now, in conversations with these clients, many of them said that prior to that point, they would have said this could not be done. It was not possible. And yet they did it, and it worked. People working from home were productive, they were focused, they were effective, they proved they could be trusted. It was quite the remarkable work from home experiment we saw play out globally. Now, for some of us, the whole remote work experience was a blissful one of working in our pajamas, not having to commute. A whole lot of people loved it. Now, for others, it was just a little bit more chaotic, particularly those who had kids at home. But for all of us, it was an adjustment. We quickly discovered our skills gap when it came to using the technology of remote work. And my favorite video still that went viral during the pandemic was this one of the lawyer who dialed into a court case in Texas, not knowing that he had a cat filter turned onto his Zoom feed. And his attempts to try and turn it off were just downright hilarious. Now, regardless of how well we adjusted to this new reality of working from home, there's no doubt that the whole experience did change the way we worked. In fact, some data compiled and shared by The Economist, which shows some really compelling insights, shows us that after the pandemic hit, we actually saw a spike in email volumes, but then this actually significantly dropped off. We began sending less emails and spending more time on video calls with each other. We also began working longer hours. Many of us, of course, weren't commuting, so spent that time working. And while our days were filled with online meetings and conference calls, the meetings themselves actually got shorter, which was a surprise to most of us. Now, the biggest question now, of course, is what would this mean for the shape and nature of work in the years to come? On the one hand, you've got some organizations who want all their staff back in the office full-time moving forward, where there are others who are actually quite happy to keep remote work arrangements permanently. One of the most wide-ranging studies looking at this question of what is the future of work going to look like was conducted by Gartner. And Gartner found that 82% of business leaders expect to keep some degree of hybrid or remote work as the norm moving forward. 47% said they're going to allow this for their full-time employees. That is significant. Now, some businesses are so certain they won't need office space moving forward, they've actually cancelled their commercial leases. Now, one of the most notable of this was the example of Pinterest, who in mid-2020 paid an $89 million penalty to cancel their office lease in Silicon Valley. Now, it's interesting though, the very same week they did that, Facebook signed a 730,000 square foot lease for office space in Midtown Manhattan. So, is the office dead? Well, it seems the tech world is placing an each way bet here. I'm still not quite sure the office is actually dead. But the reality is it does look like remote and hybrid work is here to stay in one form or another. And so there are some considerations we've got to keep front of mind as we prepare for the future of work. Here are just 5. Number 1, the first impact or consideration is around culture. Among the most pressing issues for many leaders is how to maintain corporate culture and a sense of belonging in a remote team, especially when new employees begin to join that team over time. Because after all, it's all well and good to codify or espouse the behaviors, the values that define an organization's culture, but the truth is culture is caught, not taught. And new employees get the clearest sense of how things are done and what makes an organization unique and defines them by observing the behavior and the decisions of others that they work with. Often this needs to happen face to face. The second consideration is around productivity. Although various studies in the early stages of the pandemic showed that there were massive productivity gains, whether these are actually long-term or even an accurate reflection of reality still remains to be seen. Research in late December 2020 found that 25% of businesses actually experienced a significant drop in productivity when staff were working remotely. Now, it's worth noting that in the same study, about 25%, the same number, actually found productivity really took a jump as people worked from home, and about 50%, the remaining group, really said it's made no difference at all whether people were in the office or working from home. However, this is the key point. If a quarter of businesses found that remote work actually was detrimental to their effectiveness, This is a figure that simply cannot be ignored. This is a discussion we've got to continue to have in the months and the years ahead. The third consideration is around collaboration, particularly in the area of spontaneity. The impacts of remote work on organic collaboration and incidental interaction are really important to acknowledge. While remote work has many advantages, building trust between employees is not one of them. Online, there's no water cooler, there's no nearby coffee shop for informal brainstorms, there's no place to grab a quick drink after work. To this point, a noteworthy study by Matthew Claudel at MIT found clear evidence of a positive relationship between proximity and collaboration. This is not to say that collaboration can't be done within a dispersed or remote team, but there are real benefits to people being in the same physical location and the cross-pollinating of ideas that naturally follows when that happens. Number 4, the fourth impact is around leadership and management. There's no doubt that leading, managing and motivating teams remotely is tricky, and this is especially the case when things aren't going well and performance issues need to be addressed. And many people know exactly how that feels if they're in that leadership or management role. When the relational capital is strong and trust is strong, having those tough conversations with team members is generally pretty easy. You can get a clearer sense of the full picture of a team member's life and circumstances when you're interacting with them in person and have some of those honest conversations with the full context of that person's situation. It's easy to intuit whether someone is underperforming or struggling because of factors unrelated to their work, things like home issues or relationship troubles, when you're seeing them face to face. In contrast, there's only so much gut feel that you can get via a video conference. That makes those tough conversations more difficult to engage in. Number 5, the fifth consideration is around generational equity. Very few people imagined that the generation of digital natives would have struggled in adapting to remote work, but that is precisely what the data shows us. Even though tech-savvy millennials and Gen Zs may have had no trouble with the functional aspects of working from home, it was that the practical and the psychological implications for younger generations that were a different story entirely. In research conducted a few months into the COVID-19 pandemic, what was surprising is that a majority of Gen Z and millennial employees actually said they were really struggling with remote work. This generational divide was most evident when it came to how informed different generations felt in a remote work environment, as the data on the screen indicates. Now, as you can probably see from the data here, far more Gen Zs and millennials reported feeling out of the loop or disconnected when compared with their Gen X or their baby boomer colleagues. Again, this is significant. Now, the reality is, despite the challenges and the complications of working from home, what's clear is that this will be a permanent feature of our post-pandemic work lives. This is here to stay in one form or another. Now, while many organizations and employees will welcome this as a positive change, it's important to consider the implications, both good and bad, of the biggest reworking of work in over a century.